Accusations of mental incompetence seem to fly on a daily basis in America, with politicians on both the Democrat and Republican side being claimed to not have the mental capacity necessary to hold their position, let alone some candidates running right now that seem to engender some accusations of that as well. But let's move beyond the wild accusations. Let's talk about what actually goes on in the brain. What do we know about how the brain develops as someone gets older? This is very relevant in a country where the average politician gets older and older as time goes on. Joining us to discuss, we're very lucky to once again have the deputy editor for Insider, Dave Levinthal. Welcome back to the program.
Hey, John, thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. We're not going to be talking about the Stock Act today. We're going to be talking about brains and how they act. But this is a part of Insider's Red, White, and Gray series. It's a really interesting topic to dive into. How did Insider make the decision to start talking about brains and our aging politicians?
Well, it's going to come as no newsflash to anyone that the government here in Washington, D.C. is pretty old, but we had noticed kind of anecdotally some interesting trends in the past few years. And so we analyzed it all. And this is a very data-driven project with very human implications. And the bottom line is that the Congress here in DC today is the oldest that it's ever been in US history. And the gap between those who are leading and those who are being led is as wide as it's ever been. And of course, this is coming with two very important backdrops. Number one, we've got the midterm election in 2022, and people are gonna have an opportunity to vote for their next round of leadership. But it's also coming in the backdrop of numerous issues where there's a major disconnect between the wants and desires of young Americans and those who are more aged. And that is everything from energy and the environment to social issues, civil rights issues, technology, and so forth. So this is why we're exploring the topic. And what we've been finding has been even pretty eye-opening to us.
Yeah, and we've seen that, I think we've seen instances like Dianne Feinstein fending off, protesters, Nancy Pelosi, like some of the most dramatic things that have happened in terms of politics is the clear generational divide. So let's talk about the brain. Before we dive into individuals, in your research, what is it important that we understand about the way the brain ages, especially as you start to get into the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, where more and more politicians are sort of sitting these days?
We've interviewed numerous medical experts, doctors, physicians. My colleague Kimberly Leonard has done some of the finest reporting I've seen on this. And we really put the question to them, what is the difference between somebody who is 80 years old and their brain and somebody who is 45 years old? We wanted to take a very medical, physiological look at this. And the answer, in essence, is that on balance, when you're 80 years old, you do have a very different brain than somebody who might be several decades younger than you. The ability to think quickly on your feet, the ability to have very plastic memory can be limited. Now, of course, these are broad-based conclusions, and we also found out that there are people called super agers who have brains when they're 80 or 85 or 90 that are very much like the average 40 or 50-year-old. So you can't generalize completely, but at the same time too, when we're talking about Congress on the whole, when we're talking about the government writ large, and you have what in essence has become a gerontocracy in a very real way, where the average member of that leading group, that leadership group is in their 70s, in their 80s, then questions get raised as to whether a younger generation wouldn't better serve the body politic, which I should note, John, the average age of the average American, or the median age of a median American, 38 years old, very, very different than the 58 for the US House of Representatives and the 63 for the US Senate.
Okay, I'm actually surprised it's not higher for the Senate. So that's the bit of good news that we have for this segment. But yeah, you point out there can be wide differences in cognitive capacity, even at the higher age ranges, like the 80. So simply because someone is older doesn't mean that they're going to be suffering from these things. Some people, so everybody needs to bear that in mind. And there are, of course, ways to diagnosis. There are tests that can be done. I mean, in the past couple of years, we've all had to learn about cognitive tests like person, woman, man, camera, TV, and those sorts of things. So that was a test that Donald Trump chose to take. Am I correct in assuming that there's no mandated mental capacity testing done for elected offices otherwise?
None whatsoever, John, and that goes all the way up to the presidency. Of course, we remember when Donald Trump took his test, and presidents, whether it's Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, they have released certain amounts periodically of health information if they had a physical or whatnot. But that's not mandated. There's no requirement on what they have to release. It's really voluntary and it's up to them. But we commissioned a poll with Morning Consult, our partner in this, and we put the question to all Americans, or at least a representative sample of Americans. Should you have to take a physical or a mental exam if you're president or running for Congress? The results were that the overwhelming number of Americans believe that yes, that actually should be a prerequisite to serving in higher elected office, particularly the presidency. And it was almost uniform, interestingly enough, among Democrats, Republicans, and independents. So oftentimes we're splitting things up and slicing and dicing based on party, but this is kind of one issue where there, at least in principle, was unanimity among all political philosophies.
That is actually very interesting. Now, of course, were you to propose that in the case of a particular politician, I'm sure partisanship would rear its ugly head.
Without question.
But that is very interesting. Sorry, continue.
And also, too, the poll indicated that on balance, just about as many Americans think that Donald Trump and Joe Biden both are unfit to serve as president based on considerations that have to do with their mental capacity, their physical ability to serve, and their age.
Okay, that's interesting too. It's related to this, and I don't know how much of this sort of coverage Insider has done over the past few years, but there have been a few instances where stories have come up about questioning the capacity of certain politicians. We've mentioned here, there's those conversations around Donald Trump and Joe Biden, but also people like Dianne Feinstein, people like candidates like Herschel Walker. I'm interested to know, has there been any sort of polling about, do people find those discussions to be, I don't know, like in poor taste? Do they find it acceptable to question? Because I've always, like, we've talked about it occasionally, but I always feel a little bit uncomfortable because, of course, I don't want to engage in anything that could even be perceived as ageism. But I'm wondering, did you see any instances of polling done in that area?
We didn't do any polling specifically on that issue, but to the core of your point, it's a very sensitive topic. I mean, nobody wants to be called ageist. Nobody wants to engage in ageism, or at least not most people do. At the same time, too, we're dealing with people who have an incredible amount of power and represent, in some cases, millions and millions of Americans and their interests in Washington, D.C. So if they are not in reality fully capable of doing the job that voters sent them to do, then it is, we feel, fair to explore the question of whether something else should be going on. Should there be an age limit in Congress? Should there be term limits that would limit anyone, and kind of a de facto age limit, from serving 50 years in Congress or politics? We talk about the federal judiciary. We have a story coming up that's going to explore judges who are serving into their 90s, even in one case 104 years old on the federal bench, and making decisions with binding consequences for the people who are subject to the rule of that court. So we're not just dealing in philosophy and pie in the sky stuff here. We're dealing with what's happening right now in government. Yeah. And that's a topic as uncomfortable as it may be, does have profound conclusions based on the decisions that the government is making.
Okay. I want to ask you one final question, because we were talking before the interview about how insiders work on stock trading amongst elected representatives. Seems like it certainly had to have influenced how now there's a conversation about possibly banning it. Well, I'm feeling like you guys are once again getting out in front of something. I mean, not only are you right to investigate this because, as you point out, on average, the House and the Senate are older, but we are potentially on the cusp of a presidential election that could have the oldest candidates ever, whether it's Donald Trump and Joe Biden, or if Bernie Sanders were to run again. These are guys very much on the older side. And so do you feel like that's going to be a part of the conversation during the presidential election in a way that it never really has needed to be in the past?
Well, we know it's going to be a part of the conversation, and that's a driving reason behind why we decided to embark on this project in the first place. So not only in 2024, but here in 2022. You touched on a couple of the leaders who are very old, but just look on the Democratic side in the House leadership. You have Nancy Pelosi, Jim Clyburn, and Steny Hoyer, the three top leaders for the Democrats in the House, which they have the majority in, and they're all in their 80s. What does that mean for those who, what does that mean for the electorate? What does that mean for people who are voting? So yeah, this is definitely something that we feel is going to become more and more increasingly an issue about whether government should do something. And even there's a conversation going on now at a very low level in Congress about whether there should be term limits for House leaders or Senate leaders or party leaders or whatnot, because there's also just such a groundswell, John, of younger leaders who are in their 30s, even in their 20s. We're going to have the first Gen Z candidate likely elected to Congress. And whether they just need to have a bigger voice in the conversation than they do right now about the important issues or the issues of greatest import of our day here in 2022.
Yeah. Well, once again on Cutting Edge, and I can't wait to see. I can't wait to learn more about the brain, about some of the implications of this. Everyone, definitely check out Red, White, and Gray at Insider. And as always, Dave, thank you so much for sparing us some of your time and joining us on the show.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.